I never thought I'd be the type of woman to secretly control my husband's finances. Then again, I never thought he'd be the type of man to drain our joint savings account for his mistress. But that's exactly what happened last spring when Daniel Patterson, my husband of 15 years, started withdrawing thousands of dollars from our account while I was caring for my dying mother in another state. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. What Daniel didn't know was that his grandfather, who had adored me from the day we met, had secretly left me in control of the family trust, the trust that contained the bulk of Daniel's inheritance and family fortune. While my husband thought he was cleverly hiding his affair behind business trips and late meetings, I was watching our savings disappear day by day through banking alerts on my phone. I could have confronted him immediately. I could have filed for divorce. But something inside me wanted more than just an ending. I wanted justice. So I waited, gathering evidence while developing a plan that would not only protect what was rightfully mine, but teach Daniel a lesson he'd never forget. This is the story of how I turned the tables on my cheating husband and reclaimed my life while he destroyed himself, completely oblivious to who really held the purse strings all along. My name is Melissa Patterson, though most people call me Mel. I met Daniel during my final year at Northwestern University while he was finishing his MBA. He was charming, ambitious, and came from a well-established Boston family with old money and older connections. I was a scholarship kid from a middle-class neighborhood in Michigan, studying finance and working 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet. We were an unlikely match, but Daniel seemed drawn to my independence and work ethic. I fell for his confidence and the way he talked about building something of his own, separate from his family's wealth and influence. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, I said yes without hesitation. His grandfather, Theodore Patterson, threw us an engagement party at their family estate in the Berkshires, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a view that took my breath away. "Welcome to the family, my dear," Theodore had said, pulling me aside during the celebration. He was a tall, imposing figure with a full head of silver hair and piercing blue eyes, the same eyes Daniel had inherited. "I see something special in you, something rare." At the time, I thought it was just a kind sentiment from an old man welcoming his grandson's fiancée. I had no idea how significant that conversation would become years later. We settled in Chicago after the wedding, buying a beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park. Daniel joined a prestigious investment firm while I landed a job at a financial consulting company. We worked hard, climbed our respective career ladders, and built what I believed was a solid partnership. We didn't have children. Both of us had agreed to focus on our careers first, though we occasionally discussed the possibility for the future. By our 10th anniversary, Daniel had become a senior partner at his firm, and I had been promoted to director at mine. We had a comfortable life, luxury vacations twice a year, a vacation home in Michigan near the lake, and a circle of friends who, like us, were successful professionals enjoying the fruits of their labor. Theodore had passed away 5 years into our marriage, leaving Daniel a substantial inheritance that we mostly kept untouched, reinvesting the proceeds and living primarily on our incomes. Daniel's parents had died in a car accident when he was in college, making Theodore the last of his immediate family. The Patterson family fortune was considerable. Old money from railroad investments, diversified over generations into real estate, technology stocks, and various business ventures. "Grandpa always said money should work for you, not the other way around," Daniel would tell me whenever we discussed finances. It was a philosophy we both embraced, saving and investing much more than we spent. For 15 years, I thought we had the perfect marriage. We had our occasional arguments, of course, but nothing serious. Or so I believed. Daniel traveled frequently for work, sometimes being gone for a week or more at a time. But I never suspected anything. I trusted him completely. That was my first mistake. The cracks in our foundation began to appear so gradually that I missed them entirely. Daniel started working late hours and taking more business trips. Our intimate life became increasingly infrequent, which he attributed to stress and exhaustion from work. He became protective of his phone, changing the passcode and always keeping it face down or in his pocket. I might have noticed these red flags sooner if my mother hadn't been diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. She had been healthy and vibrant at 68, still teaching elementary school and volunteering at her local library in Grand Rapids. Within weeks, she was bedridden and beginning palliative care. "You should go be with her," Daniel told me when we received the prognosis that she likely had only months to live. "Take as much time as you need. I'll handle things here." I was grateful for his understanding and support. I took a leave of absence from work and went to Michigan to care for my mother. Daniel promised to visit on weekends when he could, though his work schedule made it difficult. He made it for the first 2 weekends, then his visits became more sporadic. Always a business emergency, a client crisis, something that needed his immediate attention. "I understand, honey," I told him over the phone, exhausted after another day of watching my mother decline. "We're both just doing what we need to do right now." My focus was entirely on my mother during those 3 months. I barely checked our finances. Daniel had always handled most of the bills anyway, and we had more than enough in our accounts to cover my absence from work. I trusted him to manage things while I focused on my mother's care. It was during those quiet nights sitting beside my mother's bed that I began receiving unusual notifications from our bank. At first, I ignored them, just standard alerts that I assumed were routine transactions. But one night, unable to sleep, I opened our banking app and froze. Over the past 2 months, Daniel had withdrawn nearly $80,000 from our joint savings account in increments ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. There was no accompanying explanation, no major purchase I knew about, nothing that would justify such large withdrawals. My first thought was identity theft. I immediately called Daniel, despite it being nearly midnight. "Hey, Mel," he answered, sounding wide awake despite the hour. I could hear muffled music and voices in the background. "Daniel, are you at a restaurant? It's almost midnight on a Tuesday." "Just a late dinner with the Hoffman client. Their CEO flew in from Seattle today." "What's up? Is everything okay with your mom?" "She's the same," I said, my concern momentarily shifting back to my mother. "But I'm calling about our accounts. There have been some large withdrawals from our savings. I'm worried someone might have accessed our information." There was a pause before Daniel responded, his voice noticeably more controlled. "Oh, that. Don't worry about it, Mel. I've been moving some money around for a new investment opportunity. Should have mentioned it to you, but I didn't want to add to your stress right now." $80,000, Daniel? That's a lot to move without discussing it. "It's a time-sensitive opportunity. Look, can we talk about this tomorrow?" "I'm with clients right now." I agreed, not wanting to create a scene while he was conducting business. But something felt off. Daniel had never made a significant financial move without consulting me first. We'd always made those decisions together. The next day, Daniel called as promised, but his explanation remained vague. A private investment opportunity through a contact at work. Exclusive. Limited window. High potential returns. "You know I'd never do anything risky with our money, Mel," he assured me. "Trust me on this one. I'll show you all the details when you're back home and not dealing with so much." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. With my mother's condition worsening by the day, I couldn't handle another crisis, so I chose to trust my husband and focused on the precious little time I had left with my mom. She passed away 2 weeks later, slipping away peacefully in her sleep with me holding her hand. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight pressing down on my chest day and night. Daniel flew in for the funeral, supportive and attentive throughout the service and the gathering afterward at my childhood home. For those few days, He was the husband I remembered. Loving, considerate, my rock in a storm. After the funeral, I needed to stay another few weeks to handle my mother's affairs, her house, her modest savings, the lifetime of possessions that now needed sorting. Daniel returned to Chicago, citing unavoidable work commitments. It was while going through my mother's financial documents that a memory resurfaced. During one of her more lucid days, about a week before she died, my mother had squeezed my hand and said something peculiar. Sometimes people show you who they really are when they think no one is looking. Trust your instincts, Melissa. You've always had good ones. At the time, I thought it was just one of the mysterious, somewhat philosophical statements that sometimes came from her as the medication clouded her thoughts. But sitting in her study, surrounded by the meticulous records she'd kept her entire life, those words echoed in my mind. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I logged into Daniel's email account. We had shared passwords early in our marriage, a gesture of transparency and trust. He had likely changed his password since then, but on a hunch I tried a variation of his standard password, adding his birth year at the end instead of the usual numbers. I was in. What I found sent me reeling. Hundreds of emails between Daniel and someone named Rebecca Winters dating back nearly 8 months. Their exchanges started professionally. She was apparently a new client at his firm, but quickly evolved into flirtation and then explicit messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. There were dinner reservations, hotel confirmations, even receipts for jewelry from Tiffany and a weekend getaway to Napa Valley. The dates aligned perfectly with Daniel's business trips and late nights at the office, and the amounts matched the withdrawals from our savings account. My husband of 15 years was having an affair and funding it with our joint savings. I felt sick, literally nauseated as I scrolled through message after message. In one email, he complained about how his controlling wife monitored their finances too closely. In another, he promised Rebecca that once certain assets matured, he would leave his marriage and they could be together properly. I stayed up all night, moving from shock to disbelief to rage and back again. By morning, I had downloaded and forwarded key emails to my personal account and taken screenshots of the most damning exchanges. Then, I carefully returned his inbox to its unread state and logged out. My first instinct was to confront him immediately, to call and scream and demand explanations. But as I sat in my mother's kitchen, watching the sunrise through windows she had cleaned thousands of times over the decades, I heard her voice again. Trust your instincts. My instincts told me to wait, to think, to plan. I remembered another conversation from years ago, one I'd nearly forgotten until that moment. It had been about 6 months after Theodore's funeral, and I had received a letter from the Patterson family's longtime attorney, Martin Greenberg. The letter requested a private meeting while Daniel was away on business. Curious and a little concerned, I had agreed. Martin was a serious, silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses and an old-school formality about him. He had known the Patterson family for decades. Mrs. Patterson, he had said once we were seated in his oak-paneled office in downtown Chicago. What I'm about to share with you was stipulated by Theodore to remain confidential, even from his grandson. He proceeded to explain that Theodore, in the final revision of his will and the family trust documents, had made an unusual arrangement. While Daniel was the named beneficiary of his direct inheritance, the much larger Patterson family trust, containing the bulk of the family fortune and estimated at over $30 million, had been placed under my control as the trustee. Theodore was deeply impressed by your financial acumen and character, Martin explained. He believed you would be the more prudent steward of the family legacy. The trust was structured so that Daniel would receive regular distributions and have access to funds for legitimate business and living expenses, but the underlying assets and investment decisions were ultimately under my authority. Daniel had never been informed of this arrangement. Theodore had apparently worried that his grandson's ego wouldn't accept the idea that his wife had been given this level of control. "But why tell me this now?" I had asked, stunned by the revelation. "Because the first major distribution is coming due on Daniel's 35th birthday next year, and you'll need to authorize it," Martin had explained. "Theodore wanted you to have time to understand the responsibilities you now hold." I had left that meeting in a daze, feeling both honored by Theodore's trust and uncomfortable with the secrecy. After much reflection, I had decided to wait until the right moment to tell Daniel, perhaps when the first distribution came due. But then my career took off. We were both busy building our lives, and somehow that right moment never materialized. Years passed. The distributions were authorized routinely through the law firm with my signature, and the trust continued to grow under the management of the financial team Theodore had selected. And now, sitting in my late mother's kitchen with evidence of my husband's betrayal on my laptop, I realized that Theodore's unusual arrangement had given me significant leverage. Daniel had no idea that while he was spending our savings on his mistress, I controlled the majority of what he believed was his money. For the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wouldn't confront Daniel, not yet. First, I would return to Chicago. I would observe. I would gather more evidence. And I would speak with Martin Greenberg about exactly what options the trust arrangement gave me. As I sipped my coffee and watched the neighborhood coming to life through the window, I made a decision. Daniel thought he was cleverly hiding his affair while spending our money on Rebecca Winters. He had no idea who he was really dealing with, and by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late. I picked up my phone and texted Daniel. "Finishing. Up here. Coming home this weekend. Can't wait to see you." Then I called Martin Greenberg's office to schedule an appointment. The game had just begun. The flight back to Chicago gave me time to think. I had spent the last week meticulously planning my approach while finalizing my mother's affairs. The small inheritance she left me, about $120,000 from her house sale, retirement accounts, and life insurance, would provide me with a financial cushion independent from Daniel. I had immediately deposited it into a new account at a different bank, one Daniel knew nothing about. My meeting with Martin Greenberg was illuminating. The elderly attorney seemed unsurprised when I explained the situation in broad strokes, maintaining attorney-client confidentiality while seeking his counsel. "Theodore was quite perceptive about people," Martin had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The trust gives you considerable latitude, Mrs. Patterson. As trustee, you have fiduciary responsibility to manage the assets prudently, but you also have discretion over distributions beyond the minimum quarterly amount specified. So I could technically pause any large distributions to Daniel?" I had asked. Martin nodded slowly. "If you had reasonable cause to believe funds were being misused, yes. The trust was explicitly established to preserve the Patterson family legacy, not to fund improprieties." That confirmation gave me the leverage I needed. Daniel could access the regular quarterly distributions, enough to maintain our lifestyle, but any larger amounts required my approval as trustee. He remained unaware of this arrangement, believing the distributions came automatically as stipulated in his grandfather's will. As my plane touched down at O'Hare, I texted Daniel to let him know I'd landed. His response came quickly. "Great. Can't pick you up. Stuck in meetings all afternoon. Take a cab home. Dinner reservations at 8 at Gibson's. Love you." Gibson's Steakhouse was one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago and one of our favorites for special occasions. The gesture would have seemed thoughtful under normal circumstances, a nice welcome home after months away. Now it felt like a calculated move to maintain appearances. I responded with appropriate enthusiasm while ordering a rideshare. During the drive to our Lincoln Park brownstone, I prepared myself mentally. I needed to appear normal, a grieving daughter returning to her loving husband, Unaware of his betrayal, every instinct screamed to confront him, to demand answers, to throw his infidelity in his face. But my mother's words kept me focused. Trust your instincts. And my instincts said, wait. Our home looked exactly as I had left it 3 months ago. Daniel had clearly hired our regular cleaning service to prepare for my return. The hardwood floors gleamed, fresh flowers sat in a vase on the entryway table, and the subtle scent of lemon polish hung in the air. I wheeled my suitcase inside and took a moment to breathe in the familiar surroundings. Then I began a careful inspection. In the master bedroom, I checked Daniel's side of the closet. His clothes were all in place, but I noticed several new shirts, still bearing store tags, expensive brands, bolder colors than his usual conservative style. The receipt in one pocket showed a purchase date during my absence. In the master bathroom, I found new cologne, Tom Ford, $350 a bottle, that Daniel had never worn before. The medicine cabinet contained his usual items, plus breath mints and an additional toothbrush still in its travel case. Small changes, things most people might not notice, but to someone who had lived with him for 15 years, they screamed of efforts to impress someone new. I continued through the house, noting any changes or discrepancies, until I reached Daniel's home office. Here, I hesitated. We had always respected each other's private spaces, and his desk had been off limits by unspoken agreement. Now, I had no such compunctions. The desk drawers contained the usual office supplies, business cards, and miscellaneous items. His laptop was gone, likely with him at work. But the vintage Mont Blanc pen Theodore had given him as a graduation present was missing from its usual stand. Daniel never took that pen to work. It stayed on his desk as a memento of his grandfather. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small wastebasket beside the desk contained several crumpled papers. I smoothed one out to find a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for Aspen next month. All my love, R. Aspen. Next month. I checked the date on another utility bill in the trash. The note was from just 3 days ago. She had been in our home, in our bed, while I was burying my mother. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. A cold, clarifying fury that crystallized my resolve. I photographed the note, carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, and continued my inspection of the house with mechanical precision. By the time I finished, I had 2 hours before our dinner reservation. I unpacked, showered, and dressed with special care, selecting a black dress Daniel had always loved, applying makeup to disguise the exhaustion of grief and betrayal. I styled my dark hair in loose waves and put on the diamond earrings Daniel had given me for our 10th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, not because of my appearance, but because of the calculation behind my eyes. The woman staring back at me was playing a role in a performance where the other actor didn't know the script had changed. Daniel arrived home at 7:30, rushing through the door with a bouquet of lilies, my favorite, and an apologetic smile. "Mel!" he exclaimed, wrapping me in an embrace that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. "God, I've missed you." He smelled of his new cologne and something else, a floral scent that wasn't mine. "I've missed you too," I said, accepting the flowers and his kiss with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. If he noticed, he didn't show it. "You look amazing," he said, stepping back to admire my dress. "I wasn't sure if you'd be up for going out tonight. We can always cancel if you're too tired." "No, I'd love to go out," I assured him. "I've been eating hospital cafeteria food and takeout for 3 months. A proper steak sounds perfect." Daniel beamed, clearly relieved that I was making this easy for him. "Great! Let me jump in the shower and change quickly." While he got ready, I arranged the lilies in a vase, my mind racing through the evening ahead. I needed information about his relationship with Rebecca, about any plans they might have made, about the extent of his deception. But I also needed to maintain my cover of ignorance. At Gibson's, Daniel was the picture of the attentive husband. He ordered an expensive bottle of Cabernet, insisted I try the special, and asked thoughtful questions about my mother's final days and the funeral arrangements. To anyone observing us, we would have appeared to be a devoted couple reuniting after a difficult separation. "So," I said as we finished our appetizers, "catch me up on what I've missed here. How's work been?" Daniel launched into a carefully edited version of his last 3 months, challenging clients, successful deals, office politics. He mentioned names I recognized from years of dinner conversations, crafting a narrative that accounted for his time without revealing its true nature. "And I've been looking at some investment opportunities," he added casually, signaling the waiter for another glass of wine. "Nothing concrete yet, but there's a promising tech startup that's raising capital." So that was his cover story for the missing money. I nodded with interest, asking appropriate questions while noting how easily the lies came to him. "Actually," I said, "I was checking our accounts the other day and noticed some large withdrawals. Is that for this startup investment?" Daniel's smile flickered almost imperceptibly before returning at full wattage. "Part of it, yes. I've also been moving some funds between accounts for better interest rates. Nothing to worry about." "I'm not worried," I assured him, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Just interested. You know how I like to keep track of our finances." "That's my Mel," he said with a laugh that sounded forced, "always watching the bottom line. But seriously, you don't need to concern yourself with it right now. Focus on readjusting to being home." The dismissal was skillfully delivered but unmistakable. Daniel had never spoken to me that way about our shared finances before, as if they were his domain and I was merely an observer to be placated. "You're right," I agreed, playing my part. "I trust you completely." The relief on his face was almost comical. As dinner progressed, I steered the conversation toward his social activities, asking about friends and colleagues, watching carefully for any reaction when I mentioned certain names. "How's Jason doing?" I asked about his closest friend at the firm. "Did his wife have the baby yet?" "In January," Daniel confirmed. "A boy. They named him Thomas." "We should have them over for dinner soon," I suggested. "I've missed everyone." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "They're pretty busy with the new baby, but maybe in a few weeks." I noted the evasion. Jason had always been perceptive. Perhaps Daniel feared his friend might let something slip in my presence. "What about the Andersons? Have you seen them lately?" Another slight hesitation. "Not much. Tom's been traveling a lot for work." The pattern continued. Through several more names, Daniel had apparently been isolating himself from our mutual friends during my absence, or perhaps they had noticed something and he was avoiding their scrutiny. By dessert, I had confirmed what I suspected. Daniel had been carefully compartmentalizing his life, keeping his affair separate from our social circle, fabricating a narrative of the devoted husband working hard while his wife tended to her dying mother. As we waited for the check, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it quickly, then immediately flipped the phone face down on the table. "Everything okay?" I asked innocently. "Just work," he replied, a bit too quickly. "The Hoffman account again. They're demanding some revised projections by morning." "On a Friday night?" I raised an eyebrow. "That seems excessive." Daniel shrugged, suddenly very interested in the last sip of his wine. "That's how it goes with the big clients. Actually, I may need to go in for a few hours tomorrow to finalize things." "On a Saturday?" I kept my tone merely curious, not accusatory. "I thought we might spend the day together. I've been away so long." Guilt flickered across his face before being replaced by practiced regret. "I know, and I'm sorry. It should just be the morning. We'll have the afternoon and evening together, I promise." I nodded understandingly while mentally adding another piece to the puzzle. Tomorrow would be the perfect opportunity to continue my investigation while he was out with Rebecca. Back home, Daniel was affectionate but claimed exhaustion from a long work week, begging off any intimacy with a kiss on my forehead and murmuring, "Let's get some rest. We've got all the time in the world now that you're home." I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing pattern and knowing from 15 years of marriage that he wasn't actually asleep. He was waiting, probably for me to fall asleep so he could text her back without risk of discovery. After 30 minutes of this charade, I deliberately deepened my breathing and let out a soft, convincing snore. Within minutes, I felt Daniel shift carefully out of bed, taking his phone with him to the bathroom. I remained still, eyes closed, every sense straining to track his movements. The bathroom door closed silently, and the faintest glow of light appeared beneath it. He was texting Rebecca, no doubt explaining why he wouldn't be available tonight and confirming their plans for tomorrow. When Daniel returned to bed 10 minutes later, I maintained my facade of sleep. Only when his breathing finally settled into genuine slumber did I allow myself to acknowledge the pain piercing through my calculated planning. 15 years, a decade and a half of shared dreams, struggles, victories, and mundane everyday moments, all apparently worth less to him than whatever thrill he found with Rebecca Winters. But beneath the hurt, my resolve hardened. Daniel had made his choice, believing it would cost him nothing but our joint savings. He had no idea that Theodore's foresight had placed me in a position to determine exactly what this betrayal would ultimately cost him. Saturday morning arrived with Daniel making a show of reluctance as he dressed for his emergency work meeting. He prepared coffee for both of us, kissed me goodbye with promises to return by early afternoon, and left our brownstone with an air of practiced normality that was almost impressive in its execution. I waited exactly 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return for some forgotten item, then began the next phase of my plan. First, I called Martin Greenberg's direct line, thankful that the senior attorney had provided his weekend contact information. "Mrs. Patterson," he answered formally. "How can I assist you today?" "I need to understand exactly what assets are currently in the Patterson Trust and what controls I can exercise immediately," I explained without preamble. Martin's pause conveyed his understanding of the situation's gravity. "I can provide those details, but I would recommend meeting in person. Would Monday morning be acceptable?" "Monday will be fine for the complete briefing," I agreed, "but I need preliminary information today. Specifically, I need to know what property is held by the trust rather than in Daniel's name directly." The question clearly surprised him. "Well, the Michigan Lake House is trust property, as is the apartment in Boston near the family's original home. The brownstone in Chicago is jointly owned by you and Daniel personally, outside the trust. There are also several commercial real estate holdings, and of course, a significant investment portfolio. What about vehicles, Martin? Any cars, boats, or similar assets?" "Yes, the trust owns the vacation vehicles at the lake house, the boat and jet skis. It also holds the title to the vintage Aston Martin that was Theodore's pride and joy, which Daniel now drives as his weekend car." I smiled at this confirmation. "Perfect. And as trustee, I can make decisions regarding the use or disposition of those assets?" "Within the parameters of the trust, yes," Martin confirmed cautiously. "Mrs. Patterson, may I ask what you're planning?" "Nothing irrevocable yet, Martin. I'm simply gathering information. I'll see you Monday at 9 a.m. for a complete review." After ending the call, I booted up my laptop and pulled out the file I'd been assembling since discovering Daniel's betrayal. It contained screenshots of his emails with Rebecca, photos of the note I'd found, bank statements showing the suspicious withdrawals, and a timeline I'd constructed of his business trips that aligned perfectly with their rendezvous. Now I added a new section, assets and leverage. I listed everything Martin had confirmed was under trust control, then began researching Rebecca Winters more thoroughly. LinkedIn revealed she was a 32-year-old marketing executive who had joined Daniel's firm's client roster about 10 months ago. Her company, Winters Digital Solutions, was a boutique agency specializing in financial services marketing, exactly the type of business that would give her legitimate reasons to meet with Daniel frequently. Her Instagram, while set to private, had a visible profile picture showing an attractive blonde with a practiced smile. I sent a follow request from a new account I'd created under a pseudonym, one that appeared to belong to a marketing professional in Chicago. Given her business focus, I suspected she'd accept the connection request without much scrutiny. While waiting, I searched property records and discovered Rebecca owned a luxury condo in River North, purchased 3 years ago for $1.2 million. Public business filings showed her company was profitable, but not extraordinarily so, certainly not at a level that would support her apparent lifestyle based on the high-end restaurants and hotels mentioned in her communications with Daniel. By mid-morning, my investigation had yielded enough information to form a clearer picture. Rebecca Winters was a successful but not wealthy business owner who had connected with Daniel professionally before beginning their affair. The timeline suggested she knew he was married from the start. The expenses Daniel was covering represented significant luxury upgrades to her lifestyle: designer gifts, exclusive vacations, fine dining, and now they were planning a trip to Aspen next month. I checked our shared calendar and found no such trip scheduled. Another lie, another secret, another betrayal. As I closed my laptop, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. Another withdrawal from our joint savings account, this time for $12,000. The transaction had just been processed, which meant Daniel had likely initiated it yesterday or earlier this morning. The pieces were falling into place. Daniel was preparing for his Aspen getaway with Rebecca, continuing to fund their affair with our money while believing his deception was undetected. I took a deep breath and opened our safe, removing the documents I needed for Monday's meeting with Martin. Among them was the original letter from Theodore's attorney notifying me of my trustee status, a position that gave me not just oversight but control of the Patterson fortune. Your grandfather-in-law was a wise man, Mrs. Patterson, Martin had told me years ago. He believed that wealth without accountability corrupts the soul. He saw in you the strength of character to provide that accountability if it ever became necessary. As I replaced the safe's contents, my phone chimed with a text from Daniel. Meeting running long. So sorry. We'll try to be home by 3. I responded, with understanding and encouragement, maintaining my cover while finalizing my strategy. Monday's meeting with Martin would set everything in motion. Until then, I would continue playing the role of the unsuspecting wife, gathering evidence and preparing for the moment when Daniel would discover who truly held the financial power in our marriage. Outside, spring sunshine bathed Chicago in golden light, a stark contrast to the cold calculation taking root in my heart. The naive trust I once had was gone, replaced by a clear-eyed determination to ensure that Daniel's betrayal would cost him far more than he ever imagined. The woman who had left for Michigan 3 months ago no longer existed. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood that sometimes justice required a carefully orchestrated plan rather than an emotional confrontation. Daniel thought he had all the power. Monday would be the first step in showing him just how wrong he was. Sunday passed in a strange domestic pantomime. Daniel returned Saturday afternoon with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of expensive Chardonnay, peace offerings for his abbreviated homecoming weekend. He was attentive, solicitous, asking about my plans to return to work, and suggesting we take a real vacation soon to help me recuperate from the stress of the past few months. Maybe the Bahamas, he suggested, as we sat on our terrace, enjoying the unusually warm spring evening. Or we could go to the lake house for a couple of weeks, just the two of us, away from everything. I sipped my wine thoughtfully. The lake house sounds nice. When were you thinking? Maybe late May? Things should be quieter at work by then. Late May. conveniently after his planned Aspen trip with Rebecca. I smiled and nodded. That sounds perfect. I'll check my calendar tomorrow. We spent the evening watching a movie, Daniel's arm around me on the couch in a simulacrum of our former intimacy. I leaned into him, playing my part while mentally finalizing my approach for Monday's meeting with Martin Greenberg. When Daniel kissed me goodnight, I returned the gesture mechanically, thankful when he again claimed exhaustion as reason to avoid more intimate contact. Morning arrived with Daniel already gone. An early meeting, according to the note he left beside the gay coffee maker. I showered, dressed with particular care in a charcoal gray pantsuit that projected both authority and professionalism, and headed downtown to the offices of Greenberg, Roth & Associates. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a prestigious Michigan Avenue building with views of the lake. Martin's corner office reflected his senior status. Wood-paneled walls adorned with diplomas and professional accolades, a massive mahogany desk, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Chicago's skyline. "Mrs. Patterson," he greeted me, rising from behind his desk. Always formal, he had never once called me Melissa in all our years of interaction. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you coffee?" I declined politely and placed my portfolio on his desk. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Martin." "Of course." He resumed his seat, folding his hands precisely on the leather desk blotter. "I've prepared the trust documentation you requested, along with current valuations of all assets under management." For the next hour, we methodically reviewed the Patterson Family Trust. The value had grown substantially under the conservative but effective management of the financial team Theodore had selected, from $30 million at the time of his death to nearly $45 million now, despite the regular distributions to Daniel. "And these quarterly distributions," I clarified, pointing to a line item in the financial report. "This is what Daniel believes comes directly from his inheritance?" Martin nodded. "Yes, the distributions are set at $175,000 per quarter, adjusted annually for inflation. Mr. Patterson is aware of this amount, but believes it is automatic under the terms of the trust. He has never been informed of your trustee status. And any additional distributions require my explicit approval?" "Correct. There have been 7 such additional distributions over the past 10 years, each one documented with the specific purpose: the purchase of the Michigan property, capital for Mr. Patterson's investment in his firm's partnership, and so on." Flipped through the records, noting each instance. All were legitimate expenses we had discussed and agreed upon as a couple. Until recently, Daniel had never attempted to access large sums without my knowledge. "What would happen," I asked carefully, "if Daniel were to request a significant distribution directly, without going through me?" Martin removed his glasses, polishing them methodically with a handkerchief, a habit I'd noticed he employed when approaching a delicate subject. "Such a request would be referred to you as trustee. The firm would contact you for approval before any funds were released." "Has Daniel ever made such a direct request?" Martin's pause was brief but telling. "Yes. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Patterson contacted the firm requesting access to $500,000 for what he described as a time-sensitive investment opportunity. Following protocol, Mr. Donovan in our office informed him that the request would need to be processed through the trust administration, which would take approximately 5 to 7 business days. I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. And did Daniel pursue the request? No. He withdrew it the following day, stating he had found alternate financing. The timeline aligned perfectly with the withdrawals from our joint savings. When denied immediate access to the trust funds, Daniel had simply turned to our liquid assets instead. "I see." I closed the financial folder and opened a second one, containing the documents I had brought. "Martin, I need to make several changes to the trust administration, effective immediately." The elderly attorney's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected understanding. What changes do you wish to implement, Mrs. Patterson? First, I want to revoke access to all trust properties except the Chicago residence for anyone other than myself without explicit written authorization. Martin made a note. That would include the Michigan Lake House and the Boston apartment. Correct. Second, I want to establish a separate account under the trust for my personal use, with an initial funding of $1 million transferred from the main trust assets. This request caused Martin's eyebrows to rise slightly, but he simply noted it without comment. Third, I want to pause all extraordinary distributions beyond the quarterly payments to Daniel for the next 6 months, pending review. That is within your authority as trustee, Martin confirmed, continuing to write. May I ask the reason for these changes? For the record only, of course. I removed a USB drive from my portfolio and placed it on his desk. This contains documentation of Daniel's recent activities, including evidence that he has been misappropriating our joint funds for personal expenses related to an extramarital affair. Martin's pen paused momentarily before resuming its steady movement across the legal pad. I see. And the trust changes are to protect the assets during this situation? Precisely. I have no intention of stealing Daniel's inheritance or depriving him of his grandfather's legacy, but I will not allow him to squander it on his mistress while simultaneously draining our mutual savings. The attorney nodded, his expression grave. These changes can be implemented immediately. The property access restrictions will take effect as soon as the paperwork is filed today. The account establishment and financial restrictions will be completed by tomorrow morning. Excellent. I retrieved a final document from my portfolio. There's one more thing. I'd like to transfer the title of the vintage Aston Martin from the trust directly to Daniel's personal ownership. This request clearly surprised Martin. The vehicle is quite valuable, approximately $380,000 at last appraisal. May I ask why you wish to remove it from trust protection? It's a calculated decision, I explained. Daniel loves that car more than almost anything. By transferring it to his personal ownership, it becomes an asset that could be targeted in any future legal proceedings. Understanding dawned in Martin's eyes. A strategic concession. Very well, I'll prepare the transfer documents. As we concluded our meeting, Martin escorted me to the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he said something that reminded me powerfully of Theodore. Mrs. Patterson, if I may, there is a difference between justice and vengeance. The former repairs what was broken, the latter simply breaks something else in return. I considered his words as the elevator descended. Justice versus vengeance. The line between them seemed increasingly blurred in my current state of mind. But I wasn't acting on impulse or emotion. Each move was calculated, designed not merely to hurt Daniel, but to protect myself and what was rightfully mine. By the time I reached the lobby, I had my answer. What I sought was indeed justice, but justice with teeth. Back in my car, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail. The message was brief and professional. Mrs. Patterson, this is Laura Chen from First Midwest Bank's Fraud Prevention Department. We've noticed some unusual activity on your joint accounts and would appreciate it if you could call us back at your earliest convenience. I returned the call immediately, identifying myself to the bank representative. Thank you for calling back, Mrs. Patterson, Laura began. Our system flagged some recent transactions as potentially fraudulent based on deviation from your typical spending patterns. There have been several large cash withdrawals over the past 3 months, followed by a wire transfer yesterday for $12,000 to a resort in Aspen, Colorado. My grip tightened on the phone. What resort specifically? I asked, keeping my voice level. The Little Nell. The reservation appears to be for April 18th to 25 under the name Daniel Patterson. Almost a month away. Daniel was planning a full week at one of Aspen's most exclusive 5-star hotels, presumably with Rebecca. A quick mental calculation suggested he'd spent close to $100,000 on their affair already. almost certainly more if I counted gifts and expenses I hadn't yet discovered. Mrs. Patterson, do you recognize these transactions? I made a split-second decision. No, I don't. My husband and I have no plans to visit Aspen, and I've been out of state caring for my ill mother for the past 3 months. These withdrawals were made without my knowledge or consent. I see. Laura's voice took on the practiced tone of someone following an established protocol. In that case, I'll need to open a formal fraud investigation. This will involve freezing your joint accounts temporarily while we investigate. Would you like us to contact Mr. Patterson as well? No, I replied quickly. I'd prefer to discuss this with him first. How long will the accounts be frozen? Typically 3 to 5 business days while we investigate. You can expedite the process by filing a police report about the unauthorized transactions. I considered my options. Freezing the accounts would immediately impact Daniel's ability to continue funding his affair, but it would also force a confrontation before I was fully prepared. Still, the bank's call had accelerated my timeline. Please proceed with freezing the accounts, I decided. I'll speak with my husband and determine our next steps. After completing the necessary verification, I ended the call and sat in my car, recalculating my strategy. The frozen accounts would be Daniel's first indication that his financial house of cards was collapsing. His reaction would tell me much about how to proceed. I drove to my office building, where I'd maintained my position during my leave of absence. My company had been understanding about my situation, granting me extended paid family leave, followed by unpaid leave when my mother's condition worsened. Now I needed to speak with my boss about returning. Karen Matthews, the managing director of our consulting firm, welcomed me with a warm hug. Mel, it's so good to see you. How are you holding up? As well as can be expected, I replied honestly. But I'm ready to come back. I need structure and purpose. Karen nodded understandingly. Of course. We've been keeping your projects warm with the junior associates, but your clients have been asking when you'll return. When were you thinking of starting? Is tomorrow too soon? She looked surprised but pleased. Not at all. I'll have HR prepare everything. Your office is exactly as you left it. We discussed my ongoing projects and current client needs for another 30 minutes before I headed to my office to reacquaint myself with my workspace. Everything was indeed as I'd left it, organized, efficient, ready for my return. This part of my life, at least, remained solid and under my control. By late afternoon, I had reviewed my major client files, responded to critical emails, and scheduled meetings for the coming week. Work had always been my refuge during difficult times, and I was grateful for its steadying influence now. As I prepared to leave, I received a text from Daniel. Stuck in client dinner. Don't wait up, love you. Another lie. I wondered if he was with Rebecca or if he was scrambling to deal with the frozen accounts, which he had likely discovered by now if he'd attempted any transactions. Rather than returning to our empty brownstone, I decided to visit Jason and Sarah Williams, Daniel's closest friend and his wife, who had apparently had their baby during my absence. I stopped for a gift, a soft stuffed elephant and a stack of children's books, before driving to their home in Evanston. Sarah answered the door with baby Thomas in her arms, her face registering shock and then delight. Mel! Oh my God! We had no idea you were back in town. Just got back this weekend, I explained, accepting her awkward one-armed hug. I hope it's not a bad time? Of course not. Come in, come in. Jason will be thrilled to see you. Their comfortable suburban home was in cheerful disarray, baby gear scattered across every surface, laundry half folded on the couch, the unmistakable sense of new parents adjusting to their transformed lives. Jason emerged from the kitchen, a bottle in hand, his expression mirroring his wife's surprise. Mel, man, it's good to see you. When did you get back? I accepted his hug, noting the genuine warmth in both their greetings. Saturday. I wanted to meet this little guy and congratulate you both in person. We settled in their living room, Sarah passing Thomas to me for a cuddle while Jason cleared toys from the sofa. The baby was perfect. Tiny fingers, downy hair, that indescribable newborn scent. Holding him brought a bittersweet pang. Daniel and I had postponed having children to focus on our careers, always assuming we had time. Now, I wondered if that had been a mistake or a blessing in disguise, given current circumstances. "We were so sorry about your mom," Sarah said, adjusting a blanket around Thomas as I held him. "Daniel told us it was pretty rough at the end." "It was," I acknowledged. "But I'm grateful I could be there with her." "Daniel said you've been a rock through all of it," Jason added, passing me a glass of water. "Though I gotta say, man's been a ghost himself these past few months. We've barely seen him." I caught the hint of concern in Jason's tone. "Oh? He mentioned he's been busy with work." Jason and Sarah exchanged a glance that confirmed my suspicions. They had noticed something off about Daniel's behavior. "Yeah, super busy apparently," Jason replied carefully. "Kept canceling our usual basketball games, missing happy hours. Said he was swamped with the Hoffman account and covering for you being away." "The Hoffman account," I repeated, remembering Daniel's excuse at dinner. "He mentioned that's been demanding." Another glance between the couple. Sarah took a breath. "Mel, I don't know if we should—" "The Hoffman account closed 3 months ago," Jason interrupted, his expression troubled. "They moved their business to Goldman. Daniel's team lost the account." The confirmation of Daniel's lie hung in the air between us. I maintained my composure, though internally I was adding this piece to my growing collection of evidence. "I see," I said quietly. "I guess he's been under a lot of pressure lately." Sarah reached over to squeeze my hand. "Mel, is everything okay? Between you two, I mean?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. I considered deflecting, but found myself craving the honesty of real friendship after months of isolation and days of pretense. "I'm not sure," I admitted. I think Daniel might be seeing someone else." The lack of surprise on their faces told me everything. They had suspected, perhaps even known. "Shit," Jason muttered, running a hand through his hair. I was afraid of that. "You knew?" I asked, a hint of accusation creeping into my voice. "No, not knew," he clarified quickly. "Worried, wondered. There have been rumors at the office about him and some marketing consultant. I didn't want to believe it, especially with what you were going through with your mom." Sarah took Thomas from my arms, sensing my distress. "We didn't have anything concrete, Mel. Just concerns. Jason saw Daniel with a woman at Hugo's last month, that new place in River North. They looked close. When Jason asked him about it later, Daniel said it was a client meeting, but it didn't feel right. And I found this in his golf bag 2 weeks ago when we played at the club," Jason added, pulling out his phone and showing me a photo of a receipt. "It's for a woman's bracelet from Tiffany. Almost $4,000. I figured maybe it was for you, for when you got back, but..." I studied the receipt dated just 10 days ago. Another gift for Rebecca, undoubtedly. "Thank you for telling me," I said, surprised by the calm in my voice. "I've only been back a couple of days, but I've found evidence. I'm still figuring out what to do." "Whatever you need, we're here," Sarah asserted firmly. "A place to stay, someone to talk to, anything." Jason nodded in agreement. "Anything at all, Mel. Seriously." Their support washed over me like a warm wave, the first genuine comfort I'd felt since discovering Daniel's betrayal. I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become until that moment, how much I'd needed to confide in someone who knew us both, who could confirm I wasn't imagining things or overreacting. "Actually," I said, making a spontaneous decision, "there is something you could help me with, Jason." I explained about the pending Aspen trip and my need for concrete evidence of Daniel's infidelity. Jason, as Daniel's friend and colleague, could provide context and potentially information about Rebecca Winters that I couldn't access directly. She's been around the office a lot, Jason confirmed grimly. Her company handles marketing for several of our clients. I can ask around, discreetly, see what people know about their relationship. We spoke for another hour, formulating a plan to gather additional information while maintaining my facade of ignorance with Daniel. As I prepared to leave, Sarah hugged me tightly. You're stronger than you know, Mel, and whatever happens, you have people in your corner. Driving home, I felt something shift within me. The hurt and betrayal remained, but they were now tempered by resolve and, surprisingly, gratitude. I had friends, I had my career, I had financial security independent of Daniel, and most importantly, I had the power to determine exactly how this chapter of my life would end. Daniel's car was already in the garage when I arrived home shortly after 8. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and prepared for the next phase of our elaborate charade. The board was set, the first moves made. Now it was time to see how Daniel would respond to the gradual constriction of his financial freedom, and whether he would realize who was truly controlling the game. Daniel was pacing in the kitchen when I entered, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. He glanced up as I set my purse down on the counter, holding up one finger in the universal "just a minute" gesture. Yes, I understand that, he was saying, his voice tightly controlled. But there must be some mistake. I'm telling you I made no suspicious transactions. No, my wife just returned from out of town. She couldn't have... Fine. Yes. Tomorrow morning, then. He ended the call with more force than necessary, slapping the phone down on the granite countertop. Everything okay? I asked innocently, moving to the refrigerator to pour myself a glass of water. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd recognized early in our relationship. Apparently, our accounts have been frozen due to suspicious activity. The bank thinks someone might have accessed them fraudulently while you were in Michigan. I widened my eyes in surprise. That's terrible. What kind of activity? They wouldn't give me specifics over the phone. Said we both need to come in tomorrow to review the transactions in person. He eyed me carefully. You haven't noticed anything unusual, have you? Any charges you didn't recognize? I haven't been paying much attention to our accounts lately, I admitted truthfully. I've been focused on Mom and the estate matters. Did they say how long it would take to resolve? 3 to 5 business days, maybe longer. Daniel's jaw tightened. It's incredibly inconvenient. I have several payments pending, including the property taxes on the lake house. I nodded sympathetically, while inwardly noting this likely fabrication. The property taxes on the lake house were automatically paid through the trust, not our personal accounts. A fact Daniel had either forgotten or never knew. Well, I'm sure they'll sort it out quickly, I said, placing my hand on his arm. Banks take fraud seriously these days. Daniel seemed to relax slightly at my calm reaction. Yeah, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. He hesitated, then added, I have some cash in the safe if we need it over the next few days. Good thinking. I moved to the pantry, changing the subject deliberately. Have you eaten? I was thinking of making pasta. The rest of the evening proceeded with artificial normalcy. We ate dinner together, discussed my return to work, and watched a movie on the couch. Daniel was attentive but distracted, checking his phone frequently, no doubt trying to figure out how to manage the financial disruption I'd engineered. So, following morning, we arrived at First Midwest Bank together, presenting the united front of a couple dealing with potential fraud. Laura Chen, the fraud prevention specialist I'd spoken with yesterday, greeted us in a private meeting room. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, thank you for coming in. We take potential fraud very seriously, especially with accounts of your size. She opened a folder containing printouts of our recent transactions, highlighting the suspicious activities. Multiple large cash withdrawals over 3 months, culminating in the Aspen Resort wire transfer. As you can see, Laura continued professionally, these transactions represent significant deviations from your typical spending patterns, which triggered our automated alerts. Daniel leaned forward, his body language defensive. Those withdrawals were all legitimate. I've been managing our finances while my wife was caring for her mother in Michigan. The Aspen reservation is for a business retreat next month. Laura glanced between us. I see. Mrs. Patterson, when we spoke yesterday, you indicated these transactions were made without your knowledge or consent. Daniel's head snapped toward me, surprise and the first flicker of alarm crossing his features. You called them yesterday? I maintained my composure, meeting his gaze steadily. Yes. They left me a voicemail about suspicious activity, so I called back. I told them I didn't recognize the transactions because I didn't. You never mentioned withdrawing nearly $100,000 while I was gone, Daniel. Or planning a trip to Aspen. The silence in the small meeting room was palpable. Laura Chen, sensing the sudden tension, cleared her throat. Perhaps you two need a moment to discuss this privately. I can step out. That won't be necessary, Daniel interrupted, his smooth professional demeanor reasserting itself. There's clearly been a misunderstanding between my wife and me due to her extended absence. These transactions are all legitimate and authorized by me as a joint account holder. Laura turned to me. Mrs. Patterson, do you wish to withdraw the fraud claim? I considered my options carefully. Pursuing the fraud investigation would accelerate the confrontation with Daniel, potentially before I had all my pieces in place. Withdrawing it would give me more time to execute the rest of my plan while maintaining the illusion of ignorance. Given that my husband authorized the transactions, yes, I'll withdraw the claim, I decided. Though I'd appreciate more communication about large expenditures in the future, Daniel. The gentle reprimand carried just enough spousal annoyance to seem natural without revealing my true knowledge. Daniel's relief was visible. Of course, honey. I should have kept you better informed. It's been a challenging few months for both of us. Laura nodded, making notes in her file. Very well. I'll process the withdrawal of the claim immediately. Your account should be unfrozen by the end of business today. As we left the bank, I could feel Daniel's sidelong glances, reassessing me like a poker player who suspects his opponent might be holding better cards than previously thought. I have my first day back at the office, I said as we reached our cars in the parking lot. Dinner at home tonight? Sure, Daniel agreed, his tone carefully neutral. I'll pick up something on my way back. We parted with a brief kiss that felt like the formal gesture it had become rather than an expression of affection. As I drove to my office, I reflected on the brief flash of panic I'd seen in Daniel's eyes when he realized I'd spoken to the bank. It was the first crack in his facade, the first indication that he wasn't fully in control of his carefully constructed double life. My workday passed in a productive blur of client meetings, project updates, and reconnecting with colleagues. The familiar rhythm of professional challenges provided a welcome distraction from my personal turmoil. By late afternoon, I had reestablished myself in the office ecosystem and caught up on the major developments during my absence. A text from Jason arrived as I was preparing to leave. Drinks tomorrow? Have info, I confirmed, then checked my personal email to find a notification from Martin Greenberg. All my requested changes to the trust had been implemented. The Michigan Lake House and Boston apartment access codes had been changed. The separate account for my use had been established, and all extraordinary distributions beyond Daniel's quarterly payments had been temporarily suspended. The final piece of news was unexpected: the title transfer of the Aston Martin to Daniel's personal. Ownership had already been processed, and the documentation would be delivered to our home tomorrow. That was faster than I had anticipated, but it aligned with my overall strategy. When I arrived home, Daniel's car was already in the garage. Inside, I found him in the kitchen unpacking containers from Monteverde. one of my favorite Italian restaurants. Welcome. Home, he greeted me with studied casualness. I got your usual, squid ink, seafood pasta, and the burrata. Sounds perfect. How was your day? Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine before answering. Interesting. The Hoffman client is causing headaches. Again. The lie came easily to him, maintaining his fictional account of the non-existent client. I accepted the wine and took a deliberate sip before responding. That's strange. I had drinks with Sarah Williams this afternoon, and she mentioned Jason. Told her the Hoffman account closed months ago. It was a calculated gamble. I hadn't actually seen Sarah today, but I needed to observe Daniel's reaction to being caught in this particular lie. His hand froze momentarily in the act of serving pasta. A flicker of something, alarm, calculation, crossed his face before his expression smoothed into rueful acknowledgement. Ah, right. I meant the Hopkins account. Similar names. Hoffman. Did close. And Hopkins has been the replacement headache. Too many clients with H names. The recovery was quick and almost convincing. Almost. I see, I said, accepting the plate he offered. Easy mistake. We ate dinner in a conversational minefield, carefully avoiding direct references to finances or my time away. Instead, Daniel asked about my return to work, and I inquired about mutual friends. The performance of normalcy was exhausting, yet I found myself observing him with renewed clarity, noting how his charm now seemed calculated, his attentiveness theatrical rather than genuine. Had he always been this way? Or had I simply been blind to it, seeing what I wanted to see rather than the reality before me? After dinner, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it, then tucked the phone away quickly. Work again? I asked mildly. Yeah, the analysts need some data for tomorrow's presentation. He stood, collecting our plates. I should respond to this. Mind if I use the office for a bit? Of course not. As Daniel disappeared into his home office, I cleaned up the dinner remains, timing how long he was gone, 17 minutes to respond to a supposedly simple data request. When he returned, I was curled on the couch with a book, the picture of a trusting wife with no suspicions. Everything sorted? I asked. For now. He settled beside me, remote in hand. Want to watch something? The evening proceeded with this careful dance of normalized interactions, both of us performing roles in a marriage that now existed only in appearance. When we finally went to bed, Daniel claimed a headache and turned away quickly, maintaining the buffer of physical distance that had become our new normal. In the morning, I woke to find Daniel already gone. Another early meeting, another hastily scribbled note. I prepared for work, my mind circling back to the plan I was executing step by careful step. As I was leaving, the doorbell rang. A courier stood on our front step with an envelope from Greenberg, Roth & Associates. I signed for it, recognizing the vehicle title transfer documents for the Aston Martin. Rather than taking them with me, I left them prominently on the entryway, table where Daniel would be sure to see them when he returned home. This particular move required his discovery to be effective. My workday was productive, but punctuated by texts from Jason confirming our happy hour meeting at Sullivan's, a steakhouse, far enough from both our offices to minimize the chance of running into colleagues. By 5:30, I was seated in a quiet corner booth when Jason arrived, looking slightly harried but determined. Thanks for meeting me, he said, ordering a scotch from the passing server. I've been doing some digging, quietly like we discussed. What have you found? I asked, taking a sip of my martini. Jason leaned forward, keeping his voice low. Rebecca Winters isn't just any marketing consultant. Her firm is being considered for acquisition by our parent company. Daniel's been the lead on evaluating the deal, which explains why they have legitimate reasons to meet regularly. How long has this acquisition been in discussion? About 10 months, right around when her firm first became a client. But here's the interesting part. The deal should have been completed or abandoned months ago. Daniel's been dragging it out, requesting additional due diligence, raising questions that extend the timeline. I processed this information, seeing how Daniel had manipulated his professional position to facilitate his affair. So he's using company resources to maintain their relationship. Essentially, yes. But it gets worse. Jason took a long sip of his scotch. Rebecca's firm isn't doing as well as her lifestyle suggests. Their finances are mediocre at best. The only reason our company is even considering the acquisition is because Daniel has been enhancing the valuation in his reports. He's falsifying business documents? The implications were staggering, not just infidelity, but potential career-ending professional misconduct. Not falsifying exactly, more like presenting the most optimistic possible interpretation of ambiguous data. Technically defensible, but ethically questionable. The kind of thing that would raise serious concerns if presented to the ethics committee. Does anyone else suspect? Jason nodded grimly. My direct boss, Elaine Winters, has been asking questions. She assigned me to do a parallel analysis as a learning opportunity, but I think she wants an independent assessment. I froze at the name. Winters. Any relation to Rebecca? Her aunt. And before you ask, yes, that connection should have disqualified Daniel from leading the acquisition evaluation in the first place. Another ethical lapse he's conveniently ignored. The pieces were coming together with disturbing clarity. Daniel wasn't just having an affair. He was compromising his professional integrity and potentially his entire career for Rebecca Winters. How serious is this professionally speaking, Jason? If this came to light? He didn't hesitate. Terminal. He'd be fired immediately, possibly face legal action if the misrepresentation is significant enough. His professional reputation would be destroyed. No reputable firm would touch him. I absorbed this, turning the implications over in my mind. And Rebecca? What do you know about her personally? Not much beyond office rumors. Divorced 2 years ago. Very ambitious. Has a reputation for cultivating strategic relationships with powerful men in the industry. Jason's discomfort was evident as he added, Daniel isn't the first married executive she's been linked to, just the most obvious. And this Aspen trip? Supposedly a strategy retreat to finalize acquisition. Details. Daniel told the executive committee he's taking a small team, but no one else has mentioned being invited. The company is covering some of the costs based on his representation that it's a business trip. Company funds on top of our savings. Daniel's deception ran deeper than I had imagined. Thank you for telling me all this, I said sincerely. I know it puts you in an awkward position. Jason shook his head. Daniel's my friend, but what he's doing is wrong on every level. To you, to the company, to himself. He's not thinking clearly. He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, I think she's using him. The timing with the acquisition is too convenient. We talked for another hour, mapping out the overlapping timelines of the affair and the acquisition proceedings. By the time we parted, I had a much clearer picture of Daniel's entanglement and its potential consequences. When I arrived home, Daniel's car was in the garage, but the house was quiet. I found him in his office, the trust documents from Martin. Greenberg spread across his desk, his expression thunderous. What is this? He demanded as soon as I appeared in the doorway. I maintained my composure. Hello to you too. Those appear to be title transfer documents for your grandfather's Aston Martin. I can see that. Daniel held up the papers. What I don't understand is why they're being transferred from the family trust to my personal ownership, or why your signature is on them as the trustee. The moment of revelation had arrived earlier than I had planned, but I was prepared nonetheless. I stepped into the office, closing the door behind me. Because I am the trustee of the Patterson Family Trust, Daniel. I have been since your grandfather died. The shock on his face was absolute, a complete recalibration of his understanding of our financial reality. For a man who prided himself on control, particularly financial control, this revelation was seismic. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "Grandpa Theodore left the trust to me. I receive the distributions quarterly." "You receive distributions that I authorize," I corrected him calmly. "Theodore named you as beneficiary but me as trustee. He believed I would be the more responsible steward of the family legacy." Daniel stood abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "This is absurd. I would have known—" "How? You never read the full trust documentation. You were satisfied with receiving your inheritance and never questioned the details of how it was managed." I gestured to the papers on his desk. "But now you know." He stared at me, reassessment visible in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this now? Why transfer the car to my name after all these years?" I met his gaze steadily. "I think you know why, Daniel. The same reason our joint savings account has been systematically drained over the past 3 months. The same reason you've been lying about the Hoffman account and working late nights. The same reason you wired $12,000 to the Little Nell in Aspen for a stay next month." The blood drained from his face as he realized the extent of my knowledge. "Mel, don't." I raised my hand to silence him. "Don't insult me with denials or excuses. Rebecca Winters. Your affair has been going on for at least 8 months, funded with our money. Money I earned and saved alongside you." Daniel sank back into his chair, his carefully constructed world visibly crumbling around him. The confrontation I had been meticulously preparing for had arrived, triggered by the trust documents rather than my planned timeline. But perhaps it was better this way. Daniel off balance, caught completely by surprise, his financial safety net suddenly revealed to be in my hands rather than his. Now the real negotiation could begin. For several long moments, Daniel and I stared at each other across the expanse of his desk. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 15 years of shared history and the weight of his betrayal. His initial shock had faded, replaced by the calculating expression I recognized from countless business negotiations, Daniel assessing his position, looking for leverage, planning his next move. I waited, giving him space to process the revelations while maintaining the psychological advantage. In negotiation, the first person to speak after a bombshell often concedes power. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice unnaturally controlled. "About the affair? Since I was in Michigan. About being the trustee? Since Theodore died." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly at this second admission. "You've known for 10 years that you control my inheritance and never told me? Your grandfather requested confidentiality. I planned to tell you eventually, but the right moment never seemed to arrive." I moved to the chair opposite his desk, sitting down deliberately. "And it's not your inheritance I control, Daniel. It's the Patterson family legacy. There's an important distinction." His jaw tightened. "So what now? Financial blackmail? You'll cut off my access to the trust unless I end things with Rebecca?" "I haven't said anything about Rebecca," I pointed out calmly. "That's your decision to make. I'm simply protecting assets that I have a fiduciary duty to manage responsibly." "Don't play lawyer with me, Mel. What do you want?" I leaned forward slightly. "I want what's fair. You've spent nearly $100,000 of our joint savings on your affair. Money we earned together. You've been lying to me, to our friends, to your colleagues. You brought that woman into our home while I was burying my mother." This last point hit its mark. A flicker of genuine shame crossed Daniel's face before his defensive mask returned. "It just happened, Mel. I didn't plan it." "Affairs don't just happen, Daniel. They're a series of deliberate choices. You chose to pursue Rebecca. You chose to lie to me. You chose to spend our money on her. And according to Jason, you're choosing to compromise your professional ethics to benefit her company." His head snapped up. "You talked to Jason? About my work?" "I talked to Jason about my marriage," I corrected. "He's concerned about you, personally and professionally. The acquisition evaluation you're leading? With Rebecca's aunt's company? The one where you've been enhancing the valuation? The color drained from Daniel's face. That's confidential information. Jason had no right. He had every right as your friend who sees you self-destructing. I kept my voice level despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. But that's between you and him. My concern is what happens next for us. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Fine. You've made your point. I made a mistake. A serious one. But we can work through this. Couples survive affairs all the time. I watched him carefully, noting how quickly he shifted to damage control mode. Is that what you want? To work through this? He turned to face me, his expression earnest in a way that once would have seemed genuine, but now appeared calculated. Of course. 15 years, Mel. That means something. We can go to counseling, take some time away together like I suggested. The lake house? The lake house access codes have been changed, I interrupted, as have the Boston apartment codes. Part of my duty as trustee is securing trust properties. Daniel's facade cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through. Jesus, Mel, you're treating me like a criminal. No, I'm treating you like someone who has demonstrated he can't be trusted. There's a difference. I stood, matching his position. And you haven't answered my question. Do you actually want to save this marriage? Or are you just worried about losing access to the trust? That's not fair. Neither is emptying our savings for your girlfriend while I was caring for my dying mother. We had reached an impasse, both of us standing our ground, neither willing to concede the next move. Daniel's phone buzzed on the desk, a text notification with Rebecca's name briefly visible on the screen. His eyes darted to it reflexively, and in that unconscious gesture, I had my answer. Whatever he might say, his instinctive concern for her message spoke volumes. You should get that, I said quietly. She's probably wondering why you haven't responded. Daniel made no move toward the phone. Mel, this isn't what it looks like. A bitter laugh escaped me. It rarely is. But here's what I know for certain. You've been having an affair with Rebecca Winters for at least 8 months. You've spent our joint savings funding this relationship. You've lied consistently about your whereabouts, your activities, and your intentions. You've compromised your professional ethics to benefit her company. And you're still lying to me, now when the evidence is literally lighting up your phone. I gathered my composure, centering myself for what came next. So here's what's going to happen. I've already established a separate account under the trust for my personal use. Your quarterly distributions will continue. I won't cut you off completely because that's not what Theodore would have wanted. But all additional distributions are suspended pending review. You can't do that, he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew I could. I can, and I have. I've also transferred the Aston Martin to your personal ownership. It's now an asset outside the trust's protection. I gestured to the papers on his desk. Consider it a parting gift. Parting. Daniel stepped toward me, genuine alarm replacing calculation. Mel, wait. Let's not make hasty decisions here. We need to talk about this. We are talking about it, but I've moved beyond words to actions, just as you did months ago when you chose to betray everything we built together. I maintained eye contact, refusing to look away from his growing discomfort. I'm not making an emotional decision, Daniel. I've had weeks to consider my options, to consult with legal counsel, to examine our finances. What I'm proposing is fair and reasonable given the circumstances. You're talking like a lawyer, not a wife. And you've been acting like a deceiver, not a husband. I softened my tone slightly, allowing some of my genuine hurt to surface. What did you think would happen? Daniel? That I'd never find out? That you could drain our accounts indefinitely without consequences? That I'd forgive everything once I discovered how thoroughly you've betrayed my trust? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times throughout our marriage. I don't know. I wasn't thinking that far ahead. It was complicated. Affairs usually are. I checked my watch. It's getting late, and we both have work tomorrow. I suggest we continue this discussion when we're both calmer. Where are you going? The question held an edge of panic. To the guest room. I'll be staying there for now. Daniel reached for my arm as I turned to leave. Mel, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I gently but firmly removed his hand. Some things can't be fixed, Daniel. They can only be acknowledged and resolved. I paused at the door. By the way, I've spoken with the bank. Our accounts are unfrozen, but I've removed half the remaining balance. My fair share of what's left after your withdrawals. I've also opened a separate personal account that you can't access. His expression darkened. So that's it? You're all ready. Dividing assets? I'm protecting what's mine while we determine next steps. I suggest you use tonight to think carefully about what you really want and what you're willing to sacrifice for it. I left him standing in his office, surrounded by the trust documents that had shattered his illusion of financial control. In the guest room, I changed into pajamas and went through my nighttime routine with mechanical precision, my mind racing despite my outward calm. The confrontation had gone differently than I'd planned, accelerated by the trust documents' delivery, and more direct than my original strategy of gradually increased pressure. But perhaps this was better. The Band-Aid ripped off in one painful motion rather than slowly peeled away. I had just settled into bed when my phone buzzed with a text from Jason. How did it go? You okay? I replied simply, confronted him. We'll call tomorrow with details. A moment later, another message arrived, this time from a number I didn't recognize. This is Rebecca Winters. We need to talk. The audacity was breathtaking. I stared at the message, equal parts outraged and curious about how she had obtained my number and what she possibly thought we had to discuss. After careful consideration, I declined to respond, setting the phone aside. Let her wonder. Let her worry. The power dynamic had shifted, and maintaining my silence now was more impactful than any response could be. Sleep eluded me despite my exhaustion. Around 2 a.m., I heard Daniel's restless movements downstairs, pacing, the occasional murmur of phone conversation, the distinctive sound of ice cubes in a whiskey glass. He was strategizing, no doubt, possibly consulting with Rebecca, trying to determine his best course of action. By morning, I had barely slept, but felt strangely energized by the clarity of finally having everything in the open. I dressed for work with particular care, selecting a power suit that had always garnered compliments in important meetings. Daniel was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, unshaven and hollow-eyed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. A half-empty bottle of Macallan sat on the counter beside him. You didn't come to bed, I observed unnecessarily. Had a lot to think about. His voice was rough from lack of sleep and too much scotch. We need to talk, Mel. I agree, but not when you're like this. We both have work obligations. I poured coffee into a travel mug, maintaining my composure. Tonight would be better. I called in sick. Daniel straightened, making a visible effort to pull himself together. This is more important than work right now. I assessed him coolly. Perhaps for you. I have client meetings I can't reschedule. Damn it, Mel. Our marriage is falling apart, and you're worried about client meetings. Frustration edged his voice, the first crack in his controlled facade. Our marriage fell apart when you chose to pursue Rebecca, I corrected him. What's happening now is simply the aftermath of that decision. Daniel winced at the directness of my statement. I made a mistake, okay? A terrible, inexcusable mistake. But 15 years together has to count for something. It counted for something to me, Daniel. Enough that I never would have betrayed you the way you betrayed me. I secured the lid on my travel mug. If you want to talk, we can do so this evening when you're sober, and I've fulfilled my professional commitments. He stepped closer, desperation evident in his bloodshot eyes. She means nothing to me, Mel. It was just an escape, a distraction while you were gone. The justification was so pathetic, so cliched, that it almost made me laugh. An 8-month distraction that you funded with our life savings? What did you risk your career for? Please respect me enough not to insult my intelligence. It's the truth. I got caught up in something I didn't know how to end. But I can end it now, today. I'll call her right in front of you. I studied him, recognizing the desperate bargaining for what it was. Not genuine remorse, but fear of consequences. Do what you feel is right, Daniel. But don't do it for me or because you think it will change my position. Do it because it's the ethical choice you should have made months ago. He reached for my arm as I moved toward the door. What do you want from me, Mel? Just tell me what I need to do to fix this. I gently disengaged from his grip. That's the problem, Daniel. You think this is something you can fix with the right gesture or promise. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple repairs. His expression hardened slightly. So you've already decided? After one conversation, you're ready to throw away 15 years? I didn't decide anything. You made that choice every day for the past 8 months. I checked my watch. I have to go. We'll talk tonight. As I drove to work, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Daniel. Pleas for another chance. Promises to end things with Rebecca. Suggestions for counseling. I silenced the notifications, needing to focus on the workday ahead rather than his delayed crisis of conscience. At lunch, I met with Martin Greenberg at a quiet cafe near my office, updating him on the confrontation and seeking his counsel on next steps. Daniel will likely contact you or someone at the firm, I warned him. He may try to challenge the trustee arrangement. Martin nodded, unperturbed. He's welcome to try. But Theodore's wishes were explicitly documented. The trust was established. With you as trustee, and the arrangement is legally binding. What about divorce proceedings? How would that affect the trust? The question hung between us. The first time I had explicitly mentioned divorce as a possibility. The trust is separate from marital assets, Martin explained. Your position as trustee would not automatically change due to divorce, though Daniel could petition the court for reconsideration based on changed circumstances. And his chances of success? Martin considered this carefully. Limited. The trust documentation includes specific provisions addressing potential marital dissolution. Theodore was quite thorough. Of course he was. Theodore Patterson had possessed a remarkable ability to anticipate contingencies, including, apparently, the possibility that his beloved grandson might one day betray his wife. Thank you, Martin. I'll need your office to prepare a complete accounting of all trust assets and activities for potential use in divorce proceedings. The attorney nodded solemnly. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. And if I may? He paused, choosing his words with care. Theodore held you in the highest regard. He would be deeply disappointed in his grandson's behavior, but proud of your strength in handling this situation. The unexpected sentiment brought a lump to my throat. Theodore had been more like a father to me than my own distant parent, his approval and mentorship shaping my approach to finance and life in general. Knowing that I was honoring his faith in me provided unexpected comfort. Back at the office, I received a text from Sarah Williams. Rebecca just called Jason's office asking for your contact info. He didn't give it to her. What's going on? So Daniel hadn't immediately ended things as he'd promised. Interesting, but not surprising. By late afternoon, I had 6 missed calls from Daniel, a voicemail from an unknown number that was likely Rebecca, and an email from Daniel's personal attorney requesting a meeting, all of which I deferred addressing until I could process them with a clear head. My assistant knocked on my office door at 5:30. Ms. Chen from First Midwest Bank is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment but says it's urgent. I frowned, surprised by the unscheduled visit. Send her in, please. Laura Chen, the fraud prevention specialist from yesterday's meeting, entered looking professionally concerned. Mrs. Patterson, thank you for seeing me. I apologize for arriving without an appointment, but something has come to our attention that couldn't wait. What is it, Ms. Chen? She placed a folder on my desk. After your fraud claim was withdrawn, we continued monitoring your accounts as a standard precaution. This morning, at 10:17 a.m., your husband attempted to wire transfer the remaining balance, approximately $247,000, to an account in the Cayman Islands. My breath caught. Did the transfer go through? No. The recent fraud investigation had triggered enhanced security protocols requiring dual authorization for international transfers. When our representative called to verify with you, they couldn't reach you, so the transaction was automatically held for review. The implications were staggering. While pleading with me to give our marriage another chance, Daniel had been attempting to move our remaining joint funds offshore, beyond my reach and potentially beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, I said, maintaining my professional composure despite the churning in my stomach. What do you recommend as next steps? Given the circumstances, we strongly advise immediately separating your financial interests. Laura opened the folder, revealing several forms. I've brought paperwork to remove you from the joint accounts and establish new individual accounts with enhanced security measures. I signed where indicated, officially severing the last of our joint financial connections. As Laura prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. Mrs. Patterson, this may be overstepping, but having worked in fraud prevention for 15 years, what your husband attempted today is not the action of someone making a one-time mistake. It shows premeditation and willingness to escalate. Nodded, appreciating her candor. I understand. Thank you for your diligence. Alone in my office, I processed this latest betrayal. Daniel's morning performance, the desperation, the promises, the pleas for another chance, had been exactly that. A performance designed to distract me while he attempted to secure his financial position by transferring our remaining funds beyond my reach. The last lingering doubt about my course of action evaporated. Whatever we had once shared was gone, replaced by his calculated deception and my clear-eyed determination to protect myself. I pulled out my phone and composed a text to Daniel. I know about the attempted wire transfer to the Caymans. Don't. Be at the house when I get home. Take only your personal belongings. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. Then I called a locksmith and arranged to have our home's locks changed immediately. The time for negotiation had ended. Now it was simply a matter of resolving the practical details of ending a 15-year marriage that had died months ago without my knowledge. As I gathered my things to leave, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not the peaceful tranquility of acceptance, but the focused clarity of someone who finally sees the path forward without illusion or hesitation. Daniel had made his choices. Now I would make mine. When I arrived home that evening, the locksmith had already finished changing the locks. The house was eerily quiet. No sign of Daniel or any hasty packing. I did a walkthrough, noting that his laptop was gone from the office, along with a few personal items, but the majority of his possessions remained. My phone had been silent since I'd sent the text about the Cayman Islands transfer. Now, as I poured myself a glass of wine in the kitchen, it finally buzzed, with his response. This is a misunderstanding. I was moving funds to a new investment account, not hiding money. You're overreacting. We need to talk face to face. The explanation was so transparently false that it didn't merit a response. Investment accounts don't require routing through the Caymans, and legitimate transactions don't need to be hidden from spouses. Daniel was scrambling, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. I was about to set my phone aside when another text arrived. This one from an unknown number. This is Rebecca Winters. What you're doing is cruel and unnecessary. Daniel loves me and was planning to leave you anyway. This vindictive financial manipulation only proves why. The audacity was breathtaking. I stared at the message, contemplating how to respond, or whether to respond at all. After careful consideration, I typed, "Ms. Winters, I have no interest in communicating with you. Any issues you have with Daniel are between the two of you. Please don't contact me again." I blocked her number immediately afterward, unwilling to engage further with the woman who had participated in destroying my marriage. Whether she was a willing accomplice or merely opportunistic hardly mattered now. The house felt suddenly too large, too empty, too filled with memories of a relationship that had proven false. I called Sarah Williams, needing the perspective of a friend. "Can I come over?" I asked when she answered. "I know it's a weeknight with the baby, but—" "Of course," she interrupted immediately. "Jason just got Thomas down for the night. Come right over." 40 minutes later, I was seated at their kitchen table, a cup of tea warming my hands as I recounted the day's events to both Sarah and Jason. The Caymans? Jason's expression reflected disbelief and disappointment. While he was begging you for another chance? I don't even have words. "I do," Sarah interjected, her face flushed with anger on my behalf. "It's calculated and sociopathic. He was playing you while actively trying to hide assets." Jason nodded grimly. "In divorce proceedings, that's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal. Judges take a very dim view of hiding marital assets." "Speaking of legal matters," I said, "Daniel's attorney emailed requesting a meeting. And I imagine once Daniel realizes I've changed the locks, things will escalate quickly." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You need your own lawyer. A good one. Not just for the divorce, but because Daniel might try to challenge your position as trustee." "I've already started researching family law attorneys," I admitted. Martin Greenberg recommended a few names. Jason looked thoughtful. "There's something else you should know, Mel. I wasn't going to mention it until I had more information, but given what's happening." He exchanged a glance with Sarah before continuing. "Elaine Winters, Rebecca's aunt, called me into her office this afternoon. The acquisition evaluation of Rebecca's company is being turned over to an independent firm for review." "Why? Did she find problems with Daniel's assessment?" She didn't say it explicitly, but reading between the lines, yes. There are concerns about the valuation methodology and potential conflicts of interest. She asked me several pointed questions. About Daniel's relationship with Rebecca. "What did you tell her?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. "The truth, that I was aware they had a personal relationship outside of work that appeared to exceed professional boundaries. I didn't mention the affair explicitly, but Elaine isn't stupid. She connected the dots. I absorbed this information, recognizing its significance. So Daniel's professional position is becoming precarious as well." "Very. If the independent review finds material misrepresentation in his evaluation, he could face termination and possibly legal action from the firm. The ethics committee takes conflicts of interest extremely seriously, especially when they potentially impact multi-million-dollar acquisitions." This explained Daniel's increasingly desperate moves, the attempted wire transfer, the pleas for reconciliation. He wasn't just losing his marriage, he was potentially losing his career and reputation as well. The house of cards he had built was collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. "You can stay here tonight if you don't want to go back to the house," Sarah offered. "The guest room is small but private." I considered the offer gratefully, but shook my head. "Thank you. But I need to face this head-on. Running away, even temporarily, sends the wrong message. This is my home too, purchased with my income alongside Daniel's. I won't be driven from it." By the time I returned home, it was past 11. The house remained empty and dark, no sign of Daniel attempting to return. I checked the security system, enabling all alerts, then tried to get some sleep despite the turmoil of emotions and thoughts swirling through my mind. Morning brought a flurry of communications. 3 missed calls from Daniel. Another blocked message from Rebecca that I deleted without reading. An email from Daniel's attorney requesting an urgent meeting to discuss recent developments. And, most surprisingly, a voicemail from Elaine Winters, Rebecca's aunt, and a senior partner at Daniel's firm. Mrs. Patterson, this is Elaine Winters from Morgan Stanley Investment Management. I understand this call may seem unusual, but I'd appreciate an opportunity to speak with you regarding a matter of mutual concern. Please contact my assistant to arrange a convenient time. The message was carefully worded, professional, and intriguing. I returned the call immediately, and by 9:30 that morning, I was seated in Elaine Winters' corner office on the 47th floor of their downtown building. Elaine was not what I had expected given my mental image of Rebecca. Where Rebecca was blonde, curvaceous and overtly feminine based on the photos I'd seen, her aunt was silver-haired, angular, and radiated no-nonsense competence. A framed Harvard Business School diploma hung behind her desk alongside numerous industry awards. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Mrs. Patterson," she began, gesturing to me in a chair. "I realize this is an unusual request given the circumstances." "You mean given that your niece is having an affair with my husband?" I replied directly. Elaine's expression remained composed, though a flicker of something, embarrassment, regret, crossed her features. "Yes, that unfortunate situation is tangentially related to why I asked to meet with you." She opened a folder on her desk, removing a document that she pushed across to me. "This is a confidential internal memo regarding the pending acquisition of Winters Digital Solutions. I'm sharing it with you against protocol because I believe you deserve to understand the full context of what's occurring." I scanned the document quickly, recognizing it as an executive summary of financial concerns regarding the proposed acquisition. Key phrases jumped out: material discrepancies in valuation, potential conflict of interest, recommendation to suspend acquisition proceedings pending investigation. "Your husband has been leading the evaluation of my niece's company for acquisition by our firm," Elaine explained unnecessarily. "Recent review by our compliance team has identified irregularities in his assessment." "You're saying he deliberately inflated the valuation of her company?" Elaine chose her words carefully. "I'm saying there are significant discrepancies between his valuation and what our independent reviewers have found. Whether those discrepancies were deliberate or resulted from compromised judgment is currently under investigation." "Why? Tell me this. Isn't this confidential internal information?" "Ordinarily, yes." Elaine leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been in investment banking for 35 years. I've seen many brilliant careers destroyed by personal indiscretions, but I've rarely seen someone compromise their professional ethics as egregiously as your husband appears to have done." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words. "I also feel a certain responsibility. Rebecca is my late brother's daughter. While we're not particularly close, I did recommend her firm to our acquisition team based on some promising work they'd done. I had no idea she would pursue a relationship with the lead evaluator." The corporate speak didn't disguise Elaine's evident distaste for the situation. I found myself respecting her professional directness. "I'm telling you this," she continued, "because our firm will likely take formal action against your husband within the next 48 hours. Given your personal situation, I felt you deserved advance notice." "What kind of action?" "Termination, at minimum. Possibly a formal ethics complaint to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, depending on what our investigation concludes. If criminality is found, though that's not currently indicated, we would be obligated to refer the matter to appropriate authorities." I absorbed this information, recognizing its significance for both Daniel's future and my own negotiating position. "And Rebecca's company?" "The acquisition has been suspended indefinitely. Her firm will not be purchased by Morgan Stanley." Elaine's expression hardened slightly. "I've also personally informed Rebecca that any future attempt to leverage family connections for business advantage will not be entertained." As I prepared to leave, Elaine offered one final piece of information. Your husband doesn't know about the investigation yet. He's scheduled to be informed tomorrow morning. I thought you should be prepared for his reaction, which may be volatile. Thank you for the warning. I stood, gathering my purse. May I ask a personal question, Ms. Winters? She nodded, her expression guarded. Do you think Rebecca genuinely cares for Daniel? Or was this calculated to influence the acquisition? Elaine considered the question carefully. I can't speak to her feelings, but I will say this. Rebecca has a pattern of forming relationships that conveniently align with her business interests. This isn't the first time, merely the most professionally consequential. The information confirmed Jason's assessment and my own suspicions. Whatever emotional justification Daniel had constructed for his betrayal, he had been manipulated by someone who saw him as a means to an end rather than a genuine romantic partner. Back in my car, I called Martin Greenberg to update him on this latest development and its potential implications for the trust. If Daniel loses his position at the firm, he may attempt to access larger distributions from the trust to maintain his lifestyle, I explained. I want to ensure all proper controls are in place. They are, Martin assured me. No extraordinary distributions can be made without your explicit authorization. However, this does raise a question of whether the quarterly distributions should continue at their current level if Mr. Patterson's circumstances have materially changed. It was a consideration I hadn't fully explored, the possibility of reducing Daniel's regular income from the trust based on his actions and changed circumstances. What would be required to adjust the distribution amount? As trustee, you have discretion to modify distributions if doing so aligns with the trust's stated purpose of preserving the Patterson family legacy, Martin explained. Theodore included specific language authorizing the trustee to consider moral character and responsible financial stewardship when determining appropriate distribution levels. Send me the relevant documentation, I requested. I'll review it before making any decisions. My next call was to Catherine Martinez, the divorce attorney Martin had recommended. Her assistant scheduled an appointment for that afternoon, emphasizing the firm's expertise in high-net-worth divorce cases involving trust complications. As I drove to my office, my phone rang with Daniel's number. After 4 calls in the past 12 hours, I decided to answer, curious what new approach he might take. Mel, he began, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. This situation is spiraling out of proportion. Is it? I kept my tone, neutral. You drained our savings for your affair, attempted to wire our remaining funds to the Caymans, and apparently compromised your professional ethics to benefit your girlfriend's company. That seems proportionate to my response. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Daniel, more than you realize. I cut him off before he could launch into justifications. I met with Elaine Winters this morning. The silence that followed was deafening. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice had lost its confident edge. What did she tell you? Everything you need to know is that your professional misconduct is now under investigation. You're scheduled to be informed officially tomorrow morning. That's impossible. The acquisition evaluation was sound. I followed all protocols. Save it for the ethics committee, Daniel. I'm not interested in more lies. I checked the time, aware of my upcoming meeting. I have a consultation with my divorce attorney this afternoon. If you want to discuss settlement terms, have your lawyer contact Catherine Martinez at Goldstein Family Law. Divorce? The panic in his voice was unmistakable now. Mel, please, we can work through this. Don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. My emotions are irrelevant to this decision, Daniel. Your actions have demonstrated that our marriage is already over. I'm simply formalizing what you've already destroyed. What about trust? You can't just cut me off from my inheritance. And there it was, his primary concern laid bare. Not our marriage, not my feelings, but his access to the Patterson fortune. Your grandfather's legacy isn't at risk, I assured. him coldly, but your access to it will necessarily be adjusted to reflect your choices and their consequences. The trust was established to preserve family wealth through responsible stewardship, not to fund infidelity and professional misconduct. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Daniel's tone turned bitter. Playing God with my future, controlling everything from your moral high ground. I take no pleasure in any of this, Daniel. But I won't apologize for protecting myself and the responsibilities Theodore entrusted to me. I pulled into my office parking garage. I need to go. As I said, have your attorney contact mine for any further communications. I ended the call before he could respond, needing to maintain my professional composure before my morning meetings. Daniel's sudden realization that his career, relationship, and financial security were simultaneously imploding explained his increasingly desperate communications. The man who had so casually betrayed our marriage was now experiencing the comprehensive consequences of those choices. My afternoon meeting with Catherine Martinez proved productive. The attorney was direct, practical, and experienced with cases involving complex financial arrangements and trust complications. Based on what you've shared, we have a strong position, she observed after reviewing my documentation. The attempted wire transfer to the Caymans is particularly damaging. It demonstrates clear intent to hide marital assets. A judge would view that very unfavorably. What about trust? Daniel's attorney will likely challenge my position as trustee. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. They may try, but the trust documentation is extremely solid. Theodore Patterson's intentions were explicitly stated and legally executed, unless there's evidence of malfeasance in your management of the trust, which there isn't. Daniel's chances of successfully removing you are minimal. And the house? Our other assets? Illinois is an equitable distribution state, not a community. Property state. Given the circumstances, your husband's affair, his misappropriation of joint funds to support that affair, and his attempt to hide assets, a court would likely award you the house and a favorable distribution of remaining marital property. She leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but direct. Mrs. Patterson, you're in an unusually strong position compared to most clients I see. Your financial independence, control of the trust, and the clear evidence of your husband's misconduct give us significant leverage in negotiating a settlement. As I left her office, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: sadness for the end of a 15-year marriage, anger at Daniel's betrayal, but also a growing confidence in my path forward. The pieces were falling into place for a resolution that would protect my interests while holding Daniel accountable for his choices. Evening found me at home, reviewing documentation from both Martin and Catherine while preparing for the inevitable confrontation when Daniel learned of his impending professional disgrace. The house phone rang, a rarity in our cell phone era, and I answered cautiously. Melissa? A woman's voice I didn't immediately recognize. This is Eleanor Patterson, Daniel's aunt on his father's side, Theodore's daughter-in-law and his only living family connection besides Daniel himself. We had maintained polite but distant relations over the years, exchanging holiday cards and occasional phone calls, but little more. Eleanor, this is unexpected. I'm sure it is. Her crisp Boston accent came through clearly. Daniel called me today, quite distressed. He seems to believe you're using Father Patterson's trust to punish him for some indiscretion. So he had reached out to family, seeking allies. Interesting. That's not an accurate characterization of the situation, I replied carefully. Daniel engaged in an extended affair, spent nearly $100,000 of our joint savings on his mistress, attempted to wire additional funds offshore, and is currently under investigation for professional misconduct related to his relationship with this same woman. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. I see. Eleanor's tone had cooled considerably. He failed to mention those details. I'm not surprised. Daniel has become quite selective with the truth lately. Another pause. Father Patterson always spoke highly of you, Melissa. He said you had integrity and financial sense that reminded him of himself. I valued his mentorship greatly, I responded, touched by the unexpected acknowledgement. Well, Eleanor cleared her throat. It seems I've been misinformed about the situation. I apologize for the intrusion. Before she hung up, she added one final comment. Father Patterson would be deeply disappointed in Daniel's behavior, but I believe he would approve of your handling of the situation. The Patterson name has always valued honor above all else. The call left me contemplative. Even Daniel's family, when presented with the unvarnished facts, recognized the justice in my position. The narrative he was constructing, of a vindictive wife weaponizing his inheritance, was collapsing under the weight of reality. As I prepared for bed, I received a text from an unknown number. This is Rebecca Winters from a new number. You may have won this round, but Daniel and I will be fine without his grandfather's money or your approval. Some things are worth more than financial security. I blocked this number too, but not before capturing a screenshot as evidence of continued harassment. Rebecca's desperation was becoming apparent as her carefully constructed plan unraveled. The acquisition that would have saved her struggling company was canceled. Her lover was about to lose his prestigious position, and the financial security she had anticipated was evaporating before her eyes. Tomorrow would bring Daniel's official notification of the investigation, likely triggering a new wave of desperation. I set my phone aside and closed my eyes, mentally preparing for whatever countermoves he might attempt next in our increasingly high-stakes chess match. The email opened to reveal several attached documents and a brief message. Mrs. Patterson, you don't know me, but I worked as an executive assistant at Winters Digital Solutions for 3 years. I was let go last month in what Rebecca called necessary downsizing. The attached files show what she and Daniel were really planning, and what they did to other people before you. I couldn't stand by and watch them do it again. Amanda Nichols. With growing astonishment, I examined the attachments. Screenshots of emails between Rebecca and Daniel dating back 18 months, well before I'd left for Michigan to care for my mother. Their correspondence revealed a calculated scheme far more sinister than a simple affair. Target secured, Rebecca had written in one early email. Initial connection established through Morgan Stanley acquisition talks. He's clearly interested and dropping hints about his personal wealth. Family money, plus high position at MS. Perfect candidate. Daniel's response had been equally disturbing. Moving forward as discussed, wife completely unaware. Will begin extracting funds gradually to avoid triggering alerts. Grandfather's trust is the ultimate goal. Just need time to figure out how to access it. The emails documented their evolving relationship and financial conspiracy in clinical detail. Rebecca had apparently done this before, targeting wealthy, married executives, establishing both professional and personal relationships, then systematically extracting money before disappearing. Daniel wasn't her victim, however. He was her willing accomplice. Most shocking was the discovery that I wasn't their first target. The emails referenced 2 previous executives who had been similarly manipulated, though neither had access to trust funds on the scale of the Patterson fortune. Those men had apparently lost hundreds of thousands before Rebecca moved on, with Daniel's knowledge and apparent approval. The final emails discussed their exit strategy, plans to extract as much money as possible from our accounts and the Patterson Trust before disappearing to Mexico, and eventually to a country with no extradition treaty. They had been monitoring my discovery of the affair, adjusting their timeline as I began restricting Daniel's financial access. She's smarter than we anticipated, Rebecca had written just days before Daniel's flight. Moving to a contingency plan. Extract whatever you can immediately. I sat stunned, processing the magnitude of this revelation. My husband of 15 years hadn't merely fallen into an affair that spiraled out of control. He had been actively conspiring with Rebecca in a premeditated financial fraud scheme for more than a year. With shaking hands, I forwarded the entire email and its attachments to Catherine Martinez, Detective Ramirez, and Martin Greenberg. This was no longer just about divorce or civil asset division. This was systematic, calculated fraud potentially spanning multiple victims. Within an hour, Detective Ramirez called, his voice tense with professional urgency. "Mrs. Patterson, I've reviewed the documents you forwarded. This changes the nature of our investigation significantly. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division is taking immediate interest. Can you come to the station tomorrow morning to make a formal statement?" I agreed, still processing the implications. Catherine called next, her typically measured tone replaced by barely contained excitement. "This is extraordinary evidence, Melissa. It transforms the case from a divorce with financial misconduct to a clear criminal conspiracy. The judge will view everything through an entirely different lens now." By morning, events had accelerated beyond anything I could have anticipated. The FBI had officially opened an investigation, upgrading the case from a domestic financial dispute to a multi-victim fraud scheme. Detective Ramirez arrived at my house with 2 federal agents, taking my formal statement regarding the email and my history with Daniel. "Based on the evidence, we believe your husband and Ms. Winters have been operating this scheme for at least 4 years, explained Special Agent Lisa Brennan. The previous victims were identified in New York and Boston, both married executives, with significant personal wealth who lost between $500,000 and $1.2 million each. "How did they avoid prosecution?" I asked, stunned by the scope of their operation. "The victims were too embarrassed to press charges," Detective Ramirez explained. "Both men chose to handle the losses privately rather than face public exposure of their affairs. Without cooperative victims, prosecution became difficult." "That won't be an issue in this case," I assured them firmly. "I'll cooperate fully with whatever you need to pursue charges." After giving my statement, I met with Catherine to discuss the implications for the divorce proceedings. "This evidence fundamentally alters our approach," she explained. "We're now dealing with a criminal conspiracy in which you were the targeted victim, not merely a spouse subjected to infidelity and financial misconduct. I've already filed an amended petition with the court reflecting these developments." "What practical difference does it make for the divorce?" "Enormous difference. The court can now issue default judgments in your favor if Daniel fails to appear, which he obviously won't. We can request accelerated proceedings based on the criminal nature of his actions. And most importantly, any assets he fraudulently obtained or concealed can be subject to criminal seizure and restitution." The legal machinery moved with surprising speed once criminal fraud allegations entered the equation. Within a week, international alerts had been issued for both Daniel and Rebecca. Their photos appeared in news reports, described as wanted for questioning in connection with a multi-state financial fraud scheme. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Detective Ramirez with unexpected news. "Mrs. Patterson, we've located your husband. He and Ms. Winters attempted to board a flight from Cancun to Belize using false passports. Mexican authorities detained them at the airport. They're currently in custody awaiting potential extradition." The image of Daniel, always so polished and sophisticated, sitting in a Mexican detention center awaiting extradition, was difficult to reconcile with the man I thought I had married. Yet it represented the inevitable conclusion of the path he had chosen. "What happens next?" I asked. "The extradition process can take weeks or months, depending on how much they fight it. But given the evidence against them and the involvement of the FBI, it's likely they'll eventually be returned to face charges in the United States." That same afternoon, Martin Greenberg called with an update on the trust situation. "Mrs. Patterson, given the extraordinary circumstances and criminal allegations, I've consulted with the Trust's Legal Oversight Committee. We unanimously recommend formally removing Mr. Patterson as a beneficiary based on the moral turpitude clause, Theodore, included in the trust documentation. The clause had been mentioned previously but never invoked, a provision allowing the trustee to remove a beneficiary who engaged in criminal activity or demonstrated moral corruption that would dishonor the family legacy. What would that mean? Practically, I asked, considering the implications carefully. It would terminate all distributions to Daniel permanently, including the quarterly payments. The trust would continue under your management, with provisions to eventually transfer to other family members or charitable causes as specified in the contingency sections. I took a day to consider this significant step. Despite everything Daniel had done, permanently cutting him off from his family, legacy felt momentous, a final severing of his connection to the Patterson name and history. After careful reflection, I authorized Martin to proceed with the removal. Daniel's calculated conspiracy had violated not just our marriage vows, but every principle of integrity that Theodore had valued. The decision wasn't about revenge, but about honoring the responsibility Theodore had entrusted to me. Life settled into a new pattern as spring turned to summer. My divorce proceeded through the courts with remarkable efficiency, the judge granting expedited proceedings based on Daniel's flight and the criminal allegations. Catherine's skillful navigation of the legal complexities resulted in a judgment that was overwhelmingly in my favor: full ownership of the Chicago home, all remaining joint assets, and legal recognition that Daniel had forfeited any claim to contested property through his fraudulent actions. I immersed myself in work, finding comfort in the structured challenges of financial consulting. My firm had been understanding throughout the ordeal, even offering me a partnership track position that I gladly accepted. The professional recognition provided a welcome counterbalance to the personal turmoil of the past months. In July, almost 4 months after Daniel's flight, I received word that he and Rebecca had been extradited to the United States. They arrived separately on federal flights, Rebecca to New York to face charges related to her earlier victims there, and Daniel to Chicago to answer for his role in the conspiracy and the financial crimes against me. Catherine arranged for me to attend Daniel's arraignment, suggesting it might provide a sense of closure. I sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as he was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, handcuffs restraining his once expressive hands. He looked diminished, thinner, paler, the confident posture replaced by a defensive hunch. When he scanned the courtroom and our eyes met briefly, I saw recognition followed by shame before he quickly looked away. The charges against him were read in the formal language of the court: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, misappropriation of marital assets, attempted concealment of assets, and several counts related to his professional misconduct at Morgan Stanley. The potential sentences totaled more than 20 years if served consecutively. Daniel pleaded not guilty to all charges, but his attorney immediately requested a conference with the prosecutor, suggesting plea negotiations were already underway. I left before the proceedings concluded, having seen what I needed to see: justice in progress, methodical and dispassionate. Outside the courthouse, I was surprised to find Eleanor Patterson waiting, elegant as always in a tailored suit that spoke of old Boston money. "I thought you might be here," she said, offering a brief embrace. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. Seeing him like that was strange, but necessary, I think. We walked to a nearby cafe, finding a quiet corner, to talk. Eleanor had flown in specifically for the arraignment, feeling a family obligation to witness the consequences of Daniel's actions. "The Patterson name has weathered many storms over generations," she observed, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "But this is the first time criminality has touched us directly. Theodore would be devastated." "I think about that often," I confessed, "whether I've managed the trust as he would have wanted through all this." Eleanor reached across the table to pat my hand. "You've been exactly the steward he believed you would be, principled, fair, and strong when necessary. The family is fortunate to have you, regardless of what happens with Daniel." Her words provided unexpected validation, easing a concern I had carried silently. Theodore's faith in me had been such a precious gift. Honoring it properly through this crisis had weighed heavily on my mind. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked as we prepared to leave. "Will you keep the Patterson name or return to your maiden name?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't given it serious thought amid the more pressing concerns of recent months. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "What would be appropriate given the circumstances?" Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. "The name is yours by right of marriage, and your management of the trust has brought more honor to it than Daniel's. Actions have taken away. I think Theodore would want you to keep it, but the choice is entirely personal." 2 weeks later, Daniel accepted a plea deal, 15 years with possibility of parole after 8, in exchange for testifying against Rebecca in her more extensive fraud cases. The agreement included full restitution to me and his previous victims, though the practical likelihood of repayment seemed remote given his incarceration and forfeiture of assets. Rebecca's case proved more complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and victims. Her legal team attempted to portray her as a victim herself, manipulated by powerful men, but the evidence, including the emails Amanda Nichols had provided, painted a clear picture of her as the architect of the entire scheme. By summer's end, both legal cases had reached their conclusions. I had been granted a final divorce decree. Daniel was beginning his sentence in a federal correctional facility, and Rebecca had accepted a 20-year plea deal for multiple fraud convictions across 3 states. The Patterson Trust continued. Under my management, its purpose evolving after consultation with Eleanor and the Trust's advisory committee. We established a foundation focused on financial literacy and supporting victims of fraud, particularly those targeted through personal relationships, a way of creating something constructive from the destructive experience that had changed my life. In September, I finally took a long-delayed trip to the lake house in Michigan. The property had remained unvisited since I'd changed the access codes months earlier. Walking through the quiet rooms with their view of the water, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and detachment. This place held memories of happier times with Daniel, yet those memories now seemed to belong to a different life entirely. Standing on the dock at sunset, watching golden light play across the gentle waves, I made a decision I had been contemplating for weeks. I would keep the Patterson name, not out of loyalty to Daniel, but in honor of Theodore, whose wisdom and foresight had ultimately protected me when I needed it most. I called Eleanor that evening to share my decision. Her approval meant more than I had expected, solidifying my sense of connection to a family legacy that transcended my failed marriage. "You're more a Patterson than Daniel ever was," she declared firmly. "Theodore saw that from the beginning. It's why he trusted you with everything that mattered to him." 1 year to the day after discovering Daniel's betrayal, I hosted a small gathering at my Chicago home. Sarah and Jason with their growing son, Eleanor, who had become a genuine friend rather than merely a former in-law, and a few close colleagues, who had supported me throughout the ordeal. As we shared dinner and conversation, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The pain and shock of betrayal had been real and devastating, but they had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and connections I might never have developed otherwise. "A toast," Eleanor proposed, raising her glass. "To new beginnings, built on hard-won wisdom." The sentiment resonated perfectly. I had emerged from the wreckage of betrayal not just intact but transformed, stronger, clearer in my purpose, and surprisingly, more at peace than I had been in years. Later that night, after my guests had departed, I received an unexpected email from Martin Greenberg. The subject line read simply, "From Theodore." The message explained that Theodore had left a sealed letter with instructions that it be delivered to me in the event of significant family disruption involving Daniel. Martin apologized for the delay in discovering this directive among Theodore's personal papers. The attached scan showed Theodore's distinctive handwriting, the letter dated just weeks before his death. My dear Melissa, if you're reading this, it means my concerns about Daniel have proven warranted in some manner I could not specifically foresee. I've observed in my grandson a concerning tendency toward entitlement and self-interest that I hoped marriage to someone of your character might temper over time. My decision to name you trustee was not made lightly, nor was it intended as a slight against Daniel. Rather, it represents my belief that you possess the integrity and discernment to protect what generations of Pattersons have built, even if that protection must someday be exercised against one of our own. Whatever circumstances have led to this letter reaching you, please know that you have my complete confidence in navigating them. The trust is now yours to direct according to your best judgment. Daniel will always be my grandson, but you have become the daughter I never had, the true inheritor of what matters most. Not the Patterson fortune, but the Patterson values of responsibility, integrity, and resilience, with affection and trust. Theodore Patterson. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. This message from beyond time, from the man whose judgment I had questioned myself for honoring, provided a validation more profound than any court verdict or legal victory. Theodore had seen the potential for this crisis long before it materialized. His foresight had protected not just the family wealth, but me personally from what could have been a devastating financial and emotional catastrophe. I printed the letter and placed it in the safe alongside the original trust documents. A reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as business decisions, and that wisdom often means preparing for storms while the skies are still clear. Outside my window, Chicago's lights sparkled against the night sky, a city of ambition and opportunity that had been the backdrop for both the worst betrayal and the most profound growth of my life. Whatever came next would be built on foundations entirely of my own choosing, strengthened rather than weakened by the trials that had revealed my true capacity for resilience. Daniel had blown our savings on his lover, not knowing I controlled his fortune. But in the end, what I controlled was far more valuable than money. My own destiny, shaped by choices that honored both Theodore's faith in me and the woman I had become through fire. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.